Good afternoon, and we want to welcome everyone to our fourth session on the joint seminar that we are having today with NARUC and with Western. We appreciate you joining us. Today's program is an excellent program. We have two great panelists who know carbon capture very well, and they are going to share their expertise today with us. So we are so proud for them to be joining us. First, I'm going to introduce both of them, and then they're going to get right into their presentations. We ask that if you have questions, you have a little hand, or you can put it through to Kiera or Jasmine, and they will read the questions for you. So let's just go ahead and get started this morning. We are privileged to have William Swetra as a guest for us. He is a senior policy analyst at Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, a wholly owned subsidiary of Occidental, an international energy and chemical company. Mr. Swetra joined Occidental in 2014 as a government affairs association responsible for managing the corporation's political action committee and tracking legislative developments. In 2018, he joined the newly formed Oxy Low Carbon Ventures as a low carbon strategist and an analyst, and is currently supporting the organization as senior policy analyst. In his current role, William focuses on carbon capture and storage policies and regulations, both at the state and federal level, to incentivize the deployment of carbon management and remove technologies. Before his tenure at Occidental, Mr. Swetra worked on Capitol Hill in the 113th Congress for Congressman Kerry Bentavilla for Michigan and Majority Ways and Means Committee under Chairman David Kemp. Mr. Swetra holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Jamestown Madison University and a Master's of Arts in Public Policy from Liberty University. Our second speaker today is well known with us all. She has addressed our committee several times, especially at NARUC conferences. That's Ms. Lee Beck in the Clean Air Task Force. She is a CCUS policy innovator and director there. Lee leads KATF's engagement on federal carbon capture policy and advises CAPTA's work in Europe in hydrogen, carbon capture, and superpollutants. Lee has worked on clean energy and climate policy on both sides of the Atlantic. Lee comes to CAPTA from the Global CCS Initiative, an institute where she served as senior advisor, leading the Institute's advocacy efforts in North America, and was part of the global team focused on advocacy and policy. While at the Institute, she significantly increased her presence in policymaker education efforts on climate change, as well as the need for technology innovation and deployment. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Lee has a Master's of Arts in International Affairs and Economics with majors in Energy, Resources, and Environment and Political Economy from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Originally from Germany, she speaks German, French, and Italian. Maybe she'll give us a little bit of those in her presentation. Without further ado, though, I would love to hand it over to William Swetra and allow him to begin his presentation. Again, thank you all for being with us, and I look forward to your conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that introduction. Good morning or afternoon, depending upon where you are. I'm William Swetra, a senior policy analyst with Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. Happy Friday, and again, thank you for joining us. I'm really thrilled to be on screen with you today and have the opportunity to speak about some of the efforts within my organization to commercialize carbon capture technologies and really forge a pathway for Occidental to be successful and thrive in the low carbon economy of the future. Thank you to the Western Interstate Energy Board, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners for inviting me to speak today. I also want to thank my fellow panelist, Lee Beck. I did not know she spoke that many languages. That's awesome. She and Clean Air Task Force are extremely important on the policy and advocacy front. They're a trusted source of information and stand on great principles. So just grateful to have them involved in the CCUS universe. I really hope by the end of my presentation, you're left with an understanding of who Oxy is and the role we hope to play in CCUS and really the low carbon energy space. For perspective, A new report from the IEA, CCUS and Clean Energy Transitions that was just released last month in September states CCUS accounts for nearly 15% of the cumulative reduction in emissions in the sustainable development scenario, and moving the net zero goalpost from 2070 to 2050 would require almost 50% more CCUS deployment. Both of these statements, represent really big numbers, and I believe they're achievable, but we need to start yesterday deploying this technology. Next slide, please. So, who is Oxy? As many might not know, and the commissioner alluded to this. We're an international energy company with operations in the U.S., Middle East, Africa, offshore, Latin America. We're one of the largest oil producers in the U.S., including a leading producer in the Permian and DJ basins, offshore Gulf and New Mexico as well. Our chemical subsidiary, OxyChem, manufactures really the building blocks for a lot of the everyday products that we use. We also have a midstream component for flow and assurance marketing. Next slide, please. So we're really committed to using our global leadership in carbon dioxide management to advance a lower carbon world. There's undoubtedly skeptics out there on the actions of the oil and gas industry and really CCUS as a climate mitigation technology, but there are a growing number of data points, such as the one I just mentioned, that speak to its importance, and I hopefully will show you that Oxy is not purely about providing lip service, but putting real dollars and actions to work to commercialize this technology. When I look at the challenge in front of us, i.e. reducing emissions as quickly as possible, every tool in my toolbox, and again, growing literature is supporting the notion it would be nearly impossible and much more expensive to reach climate goals without CCUS. Next slide, please. So every single energy company, is going to have an approach to the low carbon future that's different, and I think that's okay. Competition is a good thing. That will hopefully lead us to an energy future as quickly as possible and at the least cost to society. My North Star when I go to work every day is a quote from my CEO, Vic. Every energy company should strive to be carbon neutral. Addressing climate change, is a turning point for the industry. At Oxy, we really aim to leverage our core competence, which is carbon management, via our enhanced oil recovery operations, where we've been injecting CO2 into mature reservoirs to increase production for over 40 years. And in conjunction with that production, CO2 is left behind in the reservoir and permanently stored. In our vision of the future that you see on this slide, we're going to bring large volumes of man-made or anthropogenic CO2 into our network, either from industrial source capture or directly from the ambient air. And really, carbon capture can aid decarbonization efforts in these hard-to-abate sectors like steel and cement production, and also enable low and carbon neutral and even carbon negative fuels for shipping, aviation, and is really a viable pathway for the production of low carbon or blue hydrogen, which is a very serious candidate for fuel of the future. Captured CO2 can also be utilized in the production of building materials and a myriad of other products, and used as a chemical feedstock or permanently sequestered in dedicated geologic storage. So CCUS is really quite versatile in its array of applications, and it's not limited to just, say, the power sector, for instance. And as you can see on this slide, in order to really deliver on the promise of direct air capture, which is really a key carbon removal technology, the power supplying it will need to be emissions-free or from renewables. And ultimately, what I hope this graphic conveys is the promise of a circular carbon economy, taking a problem, CO2 emissions, and developing a value chain around it that makes it an economic asset that delivers deep emissions reductions, for parts of the economy that may not have a clear, scalable solution, really to enable the reductions and fit the timeline we need to achieve climate goals. Next slide, please. So my group, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, again, a fully owned subsidiary of Occidental, is really charged with, and of course with the assistance of many other parts of the organization, to make the vision you just saw a reality. We were formed in 2018, again, with a straightforward mission: leverage our core competence, carbon management, of which we're one of the world's largest handlers of CO2, to scale CCUS to play our role in clean energy future, and also reduce our scope 1 through 3 emissions. For example, we've deployed our first solar array this past year behind the meter at one of our enhanced oil recovery operations. So we have a dedicated team that is also charged with looking at and identifying opportunities for pure CO2 storage, which I'll speak a little bit about more toward the end of my presentation. Also lead and develop carbon capture projects and create utilization pathways. One interesting example of that is Cemvita Factory. They're a Houston-based biotech startup that's developed technologies for a CO2 utilization platform that mimics photosynthesis, using CO2 as a feedstock to produce industrial chemicals and polymers. And being in the public policy group of Low Carbon Ventures, I'll give my team a plug by saying that we actively advocate for the advancement of CCUS policies with the likes of our NGO partners and industry partners. And I really believe that it's safe to say that none of these conversations around carbon capture will be happening without the world-leading incentive of 45Q. It really unlocks the economics of a lot of the projects that you're going to hear me discuss. But to grow this industry and keep the U.S. as a leader in this technology, I really believe that Congress and the federal government still and will have a substantial role to play moving forward. So let's just move on and take a bit of a closer look at some of the projects that we're working on right now. Next slide, please. First one I want to highlight is Project Intersect. This is a partnership between Energy, a biofuel producer in the panhandle of Texas, and Low Carbon Ventures that aims to capture CO2 from 2 of White's ethanol production facilities and transport that captured CO2 to an Oxy-operated enhanced oil recovery field for permanent storage. This project is of significance for several reasons. It was the first announced since the revamped 45Q. The CO2 being captured from White will be sent to a field with an Environmental Protection Agency approved monitor reporting and verification plan, which verifies that sequestered CO2 is actually being securely stored, and it's an absolutely critical component to claiming the 45Q tax credit. In my mind, having clear, transparent rules around CO2 storage is extremely important to the success of CCUS. From a social license to operate perspective, it shows the public that we really are achieving the emissions reductions we're claiming and doing it following the letter of the law. And Oxy is fortunate enough to have 2 of these approved plans that you can find on EPA's website. Second, the project is looking to be certified under California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program, recently incorporated CCUS protocol. The LCFS is a program in California that looks to reduce the carbon intensity of on-road transportation fuels sold into the California marketplace, and is truly a leading incentive for the deployment of CCUS. Next slide, please. Additionally, we've partnered with Netpower to develop emissions-free power for our operations and beyond. Their power plant system uses natural gas to produce low-cost electricity that does not generate atmospheric emissions, captures all carbon dioxide, which again can be used for enhanced oil recovery, other manufacturing processes, or permanently stored underground. Netpower currently has a 50 megawatt demonstration plant in LaPorte, Texas, and really could be a cornerstone for future energy development. And the great thing about Netpower, it offers really a dispatchable solution that can complement renewable energy growth on the grid. And as I previously mentioned, it's a big deal when it comes to powering DACs so that they can be the negative emissions technology I think that the world will need. Next slide. So right on cue here, Low Carbon Ventures is also involved in the development and deployment of direct air capture, a technology that pulls CO2 directly from the air that can be permanently stored underground or utilized in another fashion, which you see as a common trend that I'm moving towards here. This project is under the umbrella of the development company 1.5. That's a recently launched partnership between Low Carbon Ventures and Racine Capital that utilizes carbon engineering's technology. They are a British Columbia-based company, very beautiful. I've been up there to see their pilot plant. And so I just want to highlight a couple points here that really speak to the importance of carbon removal technology like direct air capture. So according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons over the 21st century. And gigatons is billions, so it's quite significant. Furthermore, the Rhodium Group states that the U.S. Needs 7 to 9 million tons of DAC capacity by 2030, increasing from there to 76 to 136 million tons of cumulative DAC capacity by 2040. You know, what this tells me is we need to start working to deploy this technology now because those are hefty numbers that we really need to achieve. The mock-up of the direct air capture facility you see on this slide, the first that will be constructed to commercial scale is going to be built in the Permian Basin of Texas with the FEED study set underway here shortly in 2021. Next slide, please. So moving on to a proposed pipeline that would capture emissions from 57 industrial facilities with the potential for up to 40 million metric tons per annum across 7 U.S. Midwest states to provide CO2 for either enhanced oil recovery or again, permanent storage where it will be used in our operations. The vision also does, though, include off-ramps for CO2 storage and utilization. It's really becoming more and more apparent that creating a CCUS ecosystem that is going to be successful is going to require a multitude of capture facilities and a multitude of options to store that CO2 to mitigate that risk. And having a large swath of emitters capturing their CO2 and putting it into a common pipeline is extremely helpful in really pulling down the transport cost per metric ton of CO2, really just due to the favorable economies of scale, that you can get there. So capture facilities on this proposed route will really cover a full breadth of CCUS opportunity. It's anchored in ethanol production, but we'll cover power production, cement, and ammonia, and among a few others. This would be a huge project that would create state and local revenue, construction, pipeline capture jobs, which we know jobs are really an important piece of any puzzle when you're trying to advance the technology. This pipeline project will likely need public policy intervention that builds upon the likes of the CO2 Invest Act that was introduced last year by Rep. Bustos. So really building that interconnected CO2 system is going to be critical to the deployment of carbon capture if we're really going to be able to achieve the scale that we need. Next slide, please. So also very critical to the success of CCUS is storage and securely storing that CO2. The good news, we have a tremendous resource in the United States that is arguably second to none. You know, simply put, we aren't going to run out of storage space anytime soon. You know, more good news, we know how to do it. We know oil and gas reservoirs, which have been holding hydrocarbons for millions of years, are great storage targets. Oxy's been doing this for quite some time, as I mentioned in our enhanced oil recovery operation. And now, you know, through work initiated by the DOE, who has really just been a great supporter of CCUS over the years and only continues to amplify that support, which will be critical moving forward to scale this technology. We're beginning to understand non-oil and gas reservoirs like saline formations to also have an enormous storage potential. So within LCV, we have a services group whose aim is to develop large-scale sequestration sites that can handle CO2 from a plethora of emitters. They also are going to look to help others with technical aspects to understand the geology of their site and also help them develop MRV plans. And next slide, please. So I just want to encourage everyone to look at our website, oxylowcarbon.com, to check out the other initiatives we have going on, like the project that just received Department of Energy funding to look at capture at one of Lafarge Holcim's cement plants in Florence, Colorado. And I'll just close by saying that CCUS is a real opportunity, as highlighted by these projects, to create new jobs, to build out new infrastructure, and reduce the carbon emissions across the country and really the world. So again, I'm just really thankful to be working in this space because the energy landscape is being shaped right now. So thank you, for your time and for listening. I look forward to the discussion, and I think I've been charged now with passing it over to Lee. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, William, for this really insightful presentation, which I think really has important touch points to what I'm going to talk about. And I really appreciate you not only elaborating on Oxy's projects, but also the importance of CO2 infrastructure, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But first, I want to take some time to obviously say thank you, Commissioner Oden, for this really kind introduction. Thank you, NARUC and the Western Interstate Energy Board for having us today, for hosting, and particularly Kara Fornstrom for hosting and putting on this fantastic webinar series, which I think is drawing a lot of attention and a lot of attendees. And we're talking not only about the US projects, but also globally. So given that this is what I worked on in the past, I'm really passionate about and really excited. As I said earlier, or as I was introduced, my name is Lee Beck. I work for the Clean Air Task Force. We're an environmental organization, and our mission is to create energy and technology pathways, or policy technology and energy pathways for a zero carbon energy system, or net zero emissions by mid-century. We're driven by optionality, which means that we are embracing all available technology solutions that could help us reduce emissions, because we recognize that each country and each region might have different challenges in achieving net zero emissions, and we can't just hedge our bets and bet on one or a few technologies rather than really commercializing all the options that we have available. We're also the only environmental organization that's exclusively dedicated to advanced energy technologies. So beyond carbon capture, we also work on nuclear, hydrogen, and geothermal, for example, as well as upstream methane emissions. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So Will, you talked about this already a little bit. So this is the sustainable development scenario, and I don't need to talk about everything that you've said, but I think this slide really shows very well that carbon capture is not a silver bullet, but really part of a portfolio of solutions that can help us not only achieve emissions reductions in the industrial sector and the power sector, but as you rightfully mentioned, also reduce emissions to net zero, or help us remove carbon from the air. What I also would like to reiterate, you mentioned the latest IEA report. For me personally, the most important headline that was also all over the media is that the IEA came out and said, look, it is virtually impossible to meet climate goals without commercializing carbon capture technologies. So I just want to reiterate this headline here, because it's really important for everyone to understand that it is a part of the tools in the toolbox that we need to to commercialize, and we need to commercialize sooner than later, so we can't delay and wait and adopt a wait and see approach. But it's really important, because the sooner we can reduce emissions, the better our chance at mitigating or preventing the worst effect of climate change. Next slide, please. So this is, I thought it was actually pretty interesting, because William, you presented a similar slide earlier. So this is how we think about the energy, the net zero carbon energy system of the future. And as you can see in the red circle, carbon capture obviously touches all, or is able to mitigate emissions from all three large sectors of emissions, including electricity through natural gas and coal power, through transportation by enabling the production of clean or low carbon hydrogen, through natural gas reforming, but also because of its application in industry. Industrial emissions from cement and steel account for more than 12% of emissions globally, and carbon capture is currently one of the few solutions, if not the only solution, that can actually reduce or eliminate process emissions from cement and steel production. And then, as I said earlier, carbon removal technologies to actually go negative and remove historical emissions from the air. Next slide, please. So before I go into the policy landscape and talk a little bit more about projects, I really want to ensure that our theory of change at CATF is understood, and the way we look at what we call climate forward innovation. So we think that all energy, or actually all technologies, go through development stages, the 3 development stages in blue on the left, before they reach wide scale use, which we classify or define as 1% of global, and in the energy space as 1% of providing 1% of global energy demand. However, in order for these technologies to go through this development stages, and successfully reach wide scale use, certain success factors have to be met. And this is where policy comes in. So for carbon capture, for example, we'd be looking at lowering the cost through deployment, through learning by doing, enabling faster project deployment, again, through getting steel in the ground, having not only commercial demonstrations, but really commercial demonstrations 1 through 5, 1 through nth of a kind, enabling affordable access to affordable financing by making sure that trust in the technology is developed, but also removing ecosystem roadblocks. And this is actually something that is a high priority for us at CATF, because ecosystem roadblocks, and in the CCUS space, we define this as access to CO2 transport infrastructure, but also geologic storage, is really important, because we are seeing this as an emerging problem in the United States. So for example, other countries are moving ahead by funding and supporting the large-scale development of large-scale infrastructure. Norway is building, the Norwegian government last week proposed to advance the Northern Lights projects, which involves offshore storage. And just today, the European Commission it proposed to invest in 6 CO2 infrastructure projects across the Union, including the UK, and we're also seeing Australia and Canada move ahead. So this is really a ecosystem, removing ecosystem roadblocks is really important for us at CATF, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, of how we think we can deploy policy to actually get going on building large-scale CO2 infrastructure, and making sure that the geologic storage, which is obviously available, is well understood, characterized, and ready for injection. Next slide, please. So just to go quickly over this theory of change, what we think is that these first innovation policies can help us prepare wide-scale availability, after which we see economy-wise greenhouse gas policies like carbon pricing and clean electricity standards come in and really help us deploy technology, which then is affordable, has lower cost, faster deployment timelines, and is well understood with other stakeholders such as financial institutions. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So I think William already talked a little bit about 45Q. From our perspective, it's the most significant carbon capture specific incentive globally. It currently or is expected to provide up to $50 a ton for CO2 via geologic sequestration, and then up to $35 a ton for utilization pathways and storage via enhanced oil recovery. William also mentioned the low carbon fuel standard CCS protocol, which is, I think, currently trading between $180 and $200 a ton. So it's emerging as one of the most important policies as well, particularly in the carbon removal space, where it incentivizes any project in the world, provided that it's sequestering emissions permanently. Next slide, please. So from our perspective, that 45Q is really this important stepping stone. It's led to the development of more than 30 projects in various stages of development in the US, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we think that to really scale up carbon capture, we need more policies. And so these are the policies that are currently being discussed in Congress, and that includes 45Q optimization. As some of you know, 45Q actually has a sunset deadline by the end of 2023. It takes between 4 to 6 years to plan and actually build a carbon capture facilities. So basically, to be eligible, current projects have to have steel in the ground by the end of 2023, provided the pandemic, but also uncertain tax equity market, and also the delay in implementation by the IRS, which just recently issued its final proposed rule, so it isn't still done with the process of implementing 45Q. CATF is proposing a 10-year extension of that sunset date, and as well as a direct pay option for the credit to make sure that we're not just unlocking the 30 projects, making sure that these can get built, but also unlocking the potential that we're seeing, since we've already seen 30 projects being announced in just couple over 2 years. We also think that we need to improve permitting at the EPA and help states make permitting primacy applications. Currently, I think it was recently said in a congressional hearing that there's only half a person working on these permitting applications. And since we're expecting more and more carbon capture facilities to come online, but to apply for permits, we really need to make sure that we're well staffed to speedily process these permits and work on this. In addition, and I will lump these following policies together. As I said earlier, we need to enable to remove further roadblocks and enable actually to get steel on the ground. So recently, just last week, a House Energy bill, the House Energy Innovation Package, passed with more than $15 billion of incentives for CCUS, and this included, for example, $7.5 billion in advanced carbon capture demonstration grants, which would help us to not just build first of a kind, but demonstrate technologies first to third of a kind, as well as investment in large-scale geologic storage hubs. So we're very excited about this achievement and hope that this bill can speedily pass through the Senate to make sure that we're having the next steps of incentives, or the next incentives necessary to build on 45Q and really make sure that we can build these projects. Next slide, please. Excellent. So this is the slide where I'm actually going to try to change to my browser, because CATF recently released this interactive map with carbon capture project in development. So I talked about the 30 projects in development, and I just want to demonstrate it quickly how it works. And I invite you to, 1 second, I think this should be working right now. And I invite you to check it out online. It's on our website, catf.us, but it's a really cool tool. And actually, Will, I was looking at the your director capture project. So here we go. And it shows you not only the different projects and details where you can click on, but it also shows you different storage basin and opportunities to make sure that it's really well understood where the geographic opportunities are that for carbon capture deployment. So I just wanted to show this quickly to make sure that everyone is, because I just thought that in my presentation, the picture really doesn't do this fantastic map developed by my colleague Deepika Nagabhushan justice. So if we can go back to the slides, I think I'll just stop sharing. So basically, these 30 projects, I can keep talking until my slides come back, for us really constitute significant innovation in in carbon capture across the US. I think William already explained this very, very well. But we're seeing the first negative emissions at scale. We're seeing industrial decarbonization. This is also a great slide. We can just go straight to this one. Industrial decarbonization, including cement carbon capture, which could possibly be the first cement carbon capture plant in the world, but also technologies or applications that are non-traditional. So thinking about natural gas power, natural gas is one of the fastest growing fuels, but there's not a single carbon capture facility on a natural gas power plant. So seeing 7 in planning across the US is really fantastic because it's a technology that's not only needed in the US, but definitely abroad. The same stands for ethanol production. I think really stands out here. There's 6 projects in ethanol production, including those that William mentioned earlier, where it's a low cost application of carbon capture, but also provides opportunities to cluster missions so they can share infrastructure, including transportation and geologic storage. And I also just wanted to talk about the jobs opportunities here. Each of these facilities can create multiple hundreds for a cement plant, more than 3,000 jobs throughout construction and development. There's a fact sheet on the Carbon Capture Coalition's website. I invite people to reach out to me. I'm happy to share it. That really outlines in how the industries are creating jobs, but not only it can create hundreds of jobs throughout the construction and development phase, but then also for operation. So I just wanted to mention this because it's obviously very important to us. And so I encourage you to check out our carbon capture map. And I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to go back to the policy. We've heard William talk about 15% of cumulative emissions reductions. There's more than 2,000 facilities globally needed, more than a couple hundred in the United States. So how can we really go from just the 30 that we have plus the 10 in operation today to more than to a couple of hundred? So going back to the innovation criteria, which also constitute the success factors, what we are working currently on, and I encourage everyone to stay tuned. We're about to launch a big report that really outlines a policy vision for the scalable carbon capture in the US, but it includes a production tax credit for natural gas power, just to give it an option, because obviously natural gas power has lower emissions than coal-fired power plants. So 45Q is less valuable to those plants than to coal plants. It also includes 0% or low cost financing for CO2 infrastructure and CO2 transportation, with grants that are incentivize additional capacity to make sure that we're not just building for single projects, but really thinking about the net zero infrastructure system of the future and start planning it, because research by the Great Plains Institute, for example, has shown that the sooner we can start planning the infrastructure that's needed, planning the carbon capture facilities, the better we will do in terms of land use impact, the more efficient, and the less it will also cost overall. And then we're also developing concepts such as geologic storage utilities, which would be similar to public utilities in the electricity sector, that would be responsible for transporting and safely storing CO2 underground. And that would work very well with geologic storage and storage clusters, where we have multiple facilities share geologic storage sites, and as well as offshore storage. So thank you, everyone. I encourage you to follow our work online on Twitter and on our website at catf.us, and please feel free to reach out to me. Here's my email, lbeck@catf.us, if you have any questions. And looking forward to releasing our forthcoming report on innovation frameworks and carbon capture policies. Thank you so much. I think we're moving now into questions. There you go.
Yes, thank you very much, Lee and William. This is Kira with NARUC, and I'll be facilitating the questions today. So we've gotten a few in, and I'd encourage our audience members to submit questions or raise your hand if you would like to be unmuted. So our first question in is on will the oil industry be the only enabler of geologic storage, or are there other industries for which geologic storage of CO2 might make financial sense?
So I can take this, but William, if you'd like to go first, please feel free. Okay. So carbon capture applications are extremely versatile, as we've seen earlier, not just for oil and gas industry, but also industrial emissions. And so all of these emissions that are being captured ideally would be either geologically permanently stored or utilized, though the utilization market is very small. So if I understand the question correctly, all the applications are obviously needing geologic storage. That being said, the oil and gas industry, thanks to its history with geology, obviously is an ideal position to commercialize these sources due to its knowledge and human capital, as well as infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And I'll just add on to that a bit. And I spoke to it a bit in my presentation. We do have a long history, and we really do understand our reservoirs. There's just so much detail and technical aspects that go into characterizing a reservoir, understanding its porosity, its permeability, the injection rate that you can use. So it's very technical. And while we believe that really the initial first place for this CO2 is going to be in enhanced oil recovery fields, just because it's already linked to existing infrastructure. In the long term, we believe that a lot of this is going to be stored underground, in permanent sequestration sites. But it is really a natural offshoot for the oil and gas industry, as Lee said, just kind of given really our expertise around CO2 and geology.
So expanding on that question a little bit, I wanted to ask a follow-up. Clearly, Occidental is, is kind of very aggressive and has taken some clear actions towards deploying CCUS projects. Can you give us kind of a sense of what the oil industry as a whole is doing, and kind of how other companies are approaching the CCUS field? I guess question for William to start, and then maybe for Lee to chime in as well.
Yeah, Oxy has absolutely kind of been aggressive in pursuing the deployment of this technology, as I spoke to, really because our core competence of handling and managing CO2, and we already do have thousands of miles of pipeline in the Permian Basin. And again, each company, the way that they're going to transition and approach the way that they provide energy is going to be different and unique to them. There are part of the Carbon Capture Coalition. There are which is a leading federal advocacy coalition for CCUS. There are other oil and gas players in that space. The Oil and Gas Climate Initiative as well. There's groups of companies in there that are looking to deploy a hub concept in various places across the country. So, while we are in competition, we do work together to deploy this technology, because again, we do see it as critical. And as Lee said, and I hope that we convey it during during our presentations, this Q&A, is that carbon capture is versatile, and it's, again, for instance, one of the two ways that we really can scale up hydrogen, water electrolysis being the other. Which is going to be a clean burning fuel. So there's a big space here for, I think, a lot of folks to dip their toe into.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on this, what I think is very important in a nascent industry like carbon capture is really having first movers who are willing to shoulder the risks and bring in new players. And I think in the US, Oxy has done a great job with this. We've seen the collaborations with different industries, with different companies. In Europe, Equinor, the Norwegian oil and gas company, and now energy company, wind energy company, is a good example. The Northern Lights project has memoranda of understanding with a variety of industries all over Europe, really bringing in new actors and making sure that we're transferring and sharing knowledge, but also building trust. in this technology. So I think we're looking at the oil and gas industry as the first mover that can help us proliferate knowledge and technology on the road to commercialization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question is on direct air capture, which I think both of you brought up in your remarks. So question for either one of you, I think. Just kind of to talk a little bit more about the scale of DIC technologies and kind of how, if there's kind of a threshold level that they need to be at in order to be feasible, how are they fueled? Would they need to be co-located with a power source or a source of emissions, or would they make sense deployed kind of anywhere throughout the world? Just if you could go into a little bit more detail on DIC, since it is kind of a very interesting but sort of a young industry.
So Lee, I'll jump in, and then please feel free. Yeah, so direct air capture is a really interesting technology. It's kind of new on the scene, but I think the great thing, for instance, about carbon engineering's technology is it's combining pieces of technology that are already mature in their own right, and we're just configuring them, in a particular fashion. But the technology that they're using isn't necessarily new. We are looking to deploy the first commercial scale plant. There are several other companies out there that do have smaller facilities. And again, we're looking to do our FEED study by 2021 to start Q1. It is important that direct air capture is linked up to renewable energy or to emissions-free power like Netpower, if it's really going to be that negative emissions technology that we believe that it needs to be. And it really can. I mean, for right now, it makes sense because you can deploy it anywhere. You can plop it down next to a CO2 pipeline, for instance. And I think folks who are, embedded in the carbon capture space know that, that pipeline piece is a bit of a challenge. Some of the sources are a bit far from sinks, and we're going to have to figure out how to finance that transport piece. But with carbon capture, you don't have that piece. So you can identify great storage areas and then put a direct air capture facility there. We also are looking to combine it. So we combine it with Netpower, direct air capture, and maybe another industrial facility. So that whole industrial park could be potentially net negative. So there's a lot of applications. And again, it can be deployed anywhere. There are restraints, obviously, but the technology is extremely promising. And I know, at Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, at Rashim, at Carbon Engineering, we're really excited about putting this to work and building this plant.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add.
Great, thank you. So our next question, the 45Q credits have, of course, been discussed on some of the previous webinars in this series, mainly on our webinar last week, which was dedicated to financial incentives for carbon capture. And Lee, you had mentioned that the upcoming deadline for the expiration of the current iteration of the 45Q tax credits may be challenging for some CCUS projects to meet, just given the work that goes into understanding the feasibility and design of a CCUS project before construction can commence. Can you talk a little more about what goes into a CCUS project before construction starts? What exactly happens in that 4 to 6 year period? And how important has it been for the Department of Energy to provide some funding assistance for some of the FEED studies for some of the CCUS projects that are under consideration?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start, and then I might hand it over to William, who's obviously more in the business of building these projects. But I mean, I think I'll speak from a policy perspective. I think 45Q really signals that there is a business case to investment in carbon capture. So this is the first kind of incentive for partnerships to form, for companies to consider carbon capture as a decarbonization pathway. And then I think once you're willing to kind of engage in a project, obviously for companies that have never done carbon capture before, and there are many, it's really a learning process. And then as they're scoping out potential projects, and you mentioned DOE funding, it has been extremely important because it basically lowers the risk of exploring avenues to decarbonization by providing funding for feasibility study or front-end engineering design, so as to really understand if these projects are feasible. So this is the first step. Obviously, there are permits involved, there's planning involved, so there's a lot of things that need to check the box before construction can begin. I think William probably has a better map or outline or a timeline in his mind than me, but from a policy perspective, it's really important that we can provide certainty through policy incentives like 45Q, but also deployment assistance, and that includes the deployment grants, the $7.5 billion, which are included in the House Energy Bill, that can come in and a cost share, 50-50 cost share, to also lower the risk and enable projects to either potentially get outside financing, which has been a problem. Most of the projects that are currently in operation globally have been financed right off the balance sheet of companies. Few to none have been actually able to receive traditional loans. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, but it's obviously more complicated if you're working with a technology that doesn't have where the trust really hasn't been developed. So this is why we were thinking just giving companies a little bit more time to develop it. And up to just recently, it was also very uncertain of how to actually claim 45Q, as I mentioned in my presentation. So a lot of things go into why we're asking or why we're suggesting this extension and into planning these projects. And one of the key objectives of policy and demonstration and enabling learning by doing through demonstration for us is really shortening that timeline so we can deploy and get steel in the ground faster than we're doing it today. William, handing over to you to give an actual project insight.
No, that was great, Lee. And I don't think that long construction periods are really unique to carbon capture projects. I think they're uniform across any really capital intensive projects. When you're talking about deploying potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, there is an extensive amount of due diligence that goes into that before you even put the first piece of steel into the ground. So to try to wrap into the DOE piece here, the cement project that I mentioned during my presentation, it's us, Total, Large Wholesome, and Savante. This is a lot of organizations to pull together, to work together. There's a lot of conversations to be had, and the DOE providing a cost share for us to look at that FEED study, is great. It helps us study this. We've seen that there is a project there, and we start to get down into really the nitty-gritty of the economics, look at procurement of materials, look at potential pipeline routes to where we could potentially sequester that CO2. Will it be more efficient if we go up here and potentially grab this capture plant? So it's really a long discussion between industry partners because, again, when you're deploying that much money in a project, you're going to take your time to make sure that you're checking every box because we need these projects to be successful.
Great. And speaking of successful projects, we had a question for you, William, on what Oxy has learned from the two kind of leading examples of CCUS in the power sector in North America, the Petronova project in Texas and the Boundary Dam project in Canada. And what does Oxy see as the potential for carbon dioxide used for enhanced oil recovery?
So I think as I briefly mentioned, again, we see the original, the first opportunity here is to put CO2 into enhanced oil recovery reservoirs, because in the Permian Basin of Texas, there already is a lot of CO2 infrastructure in place. So those are identifiable targets that are really close to infrastructure. So we won't have to build a really long pipeline. In terms of learning, well, Petronova is a publicly funded project from the DOE, so there's a lot of literature out there about cost of capture, their capture rate, the footprint of the facility, how well the capture plant has performed. So they really are all important. And again, as I think we touched on a lot in her presentation, is that these costs, as we continue to build them, continue to learn by doing, we're really gonna pull down that cost of capture per metric ton. So each one of these projects learns from the previous one before them.
Great, and as our last question, so that we can wrap up and end on time, I think again a question for both of you, but I'll start with you, Lee. So it seems that CCUS is clearly very important to reaching our low carbon energy goals, yet there's maybe kind of a lack of awareness among the broader public. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of level of public awareness of CCUS and how that's maybe changed in the last few years, and kind of how the public is or is not really accepting the technology yet?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. I would agree that for a long time it was very niche technology, but I think the profile has really risen over the past 2 years, particularly, of course, 45Q really raised the profile. And with all the project announcements, I mean, 30 projects is a lot. There was a lot of mainstream media reporting about it. But I think what's really got people excited about it is direct air capture carbon removal. That has really brought it to a next level. People are very excited to learn about this. We're getting a lot of questions, particularly about carbon removal from the broader public. But since it's a topic that has really come up also in the context of increased or more ambitious climate goals globally, it's being mentioned more and more, and people are realizing that with continuous repetition of that message that it's not possible or virtually impossible to reach climate goals without carbon capture, it's really seeping more into mainstream media and conversations, and the climate conversation and the clean energy conversation. So I think we're really seeing positive momentum. However, I do think that we need to work more on broader public awareness, but particularly in areas where we're looking to implement projects, it's really important to engage with the local community, make sure that it's understood, that the community is comfortable with the project, and that it really can provide the benefits that I said earlier about jobs, low carbon energy, decarbonization, that these benefits are understood, but also the impacts on the potential impacts on the communities are taken into account.
Yeah, I agree, Lee. And 45Q, of course, brought this into the mainstream because it helped economics. We saw these project announcements, and I think, as Lee pointed out, as the climate conversation elevates, we all know about renewable energy, and as we're seeing that might not be enough to get us there because energy consumption is going to continue to grow, that we're going to need other technologies and potentially carbon removal technologies if we do kind of blow through our carbon budget. And I'll just finish by saying, because Lee pointed this out in her presentation, I think it bears repeating, is that this is one of those rare issues, I think, on Capitol Hill where you can find a bit of bipartisan support in a time when that is not really the norm. So it's an important technology, but there is a tremendous amount of work to be done yet to really have this technology fulfill its potential. And I know Lee and I know myself and everyone who works in this space is just excited to have that challenge.
Thank you both very much for your comments, and thank you to our audience members for submitting some great questions today. So if we could go to the next slide, I just wanted to announce some upcoming events. Of course, this is the fourth in our series of 6 webinars, so we hope that you can join us next week for the International Project Update. That will be next Friday, October 9th, again at the same time, 1:00 p.m. Eastern. And then our final webinar on regulatory considerations will be the following week, October 16th. We have some other webinars coming up from the Center for Partnerships and Innovation as well. And our annual meeting is happening in November, starting Thursday, November 5th, and registration is open for that. You can see our agenda at this link. And last but not least, we wanted to call attention to an upcoming event by our co-sponsoring organization here, the Western Interstate Energy Board, their fall 2020 joint CREPC-YRAB meeting webinar series, starting on Friday, October 23rd, just 1 week after this webinar series concludes. And I think that's all we have for upcoming events. I wanted to pass the microphone back to Commissioner Oden to take us out. Commissioner Oden?
Thank you, Kiara. Let me just quickly say, and we appreciate everyone joining us today. These have been great seminars. Thank William and Lee for their presentations, excellent presentations and information. Make sure that you can catch these again. Kiara will send out a link for these. Let me also say thank you to our partnership with DOE and also Western Interstate Energy Board for their sponsoring of these seminars. I would be amiss if I did not thank my Vice Chairman, Kara Forstrom. She has worked hard in putting these things together and talking all to the different participants, and also Kiara and Jasmine with NARUC. We appreciate it. Wishing you all a great weekend and a safe weekend, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. Thank you all.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kira. Special thanks to Kira.
Thank you, Kiara.
Thank you all as well. Have a good weekend.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.